If the United States announces that we are buying 1 million Bitcoin, that's just a global seismic shock. I think first the Bitcoin price goes through the roof, right? I think we probably go very quickly to something like $1 million per Bitcoin.
I think it's pretty clear that we expect Bitcoin to move much faster and much further than gold, right? So in terms of like the strategic leverage, there's an asymmetric advantage for the United States to having Bitcoin monetized relative to gold.
All right. Welcome back to the Bitcoin Policy Hour, a weekly podcast hosted by the Bitcoin Policy Institute. I'm your host, Zack Cohen, associate with the Bitcoin Policy Institute, and I'm joined each week by my colleagues Matthew Pines, who's BPI's executive director, and Zack Shapiro, BPI's head of policy. Quick plug here, if you enjoy our conversation, highly encourage you to learn more about our 2025 Bitcoin Policy Summit by visiting btcpolicysummit.org. Both Matt and Zack will be speaking at the event, among other thought leaders and government officials. So if you tuned in with us last week, we dug into the tariff conversation, kind of laid the groundwork for a lot of the geopolitical and geo-economic conversation that we're going to have today. So, going a little bit more in depth here. And to do so, I'm going to kick it over to Pines first here. Pines, what's the status of sort of geo-economic changes in the world right now? Where does the dollar stand? And how is the Trump administration looking at our current status?
Sure, just start me off with the easy questions here, Zach. So how much time do we got? I guess the TLDR is I'd separate out, and I can't remember which podcast I said it on. It might have been this one last week, but it bears repeating, which is distinguishing between the dollar as essentially this cross-currency exchange rate, typically quoted as like the DXY, the dollar or trade-weighted kind of currency exchange rate, and the dollar network, which is usually, a reference to kind of this global system that has been constructed in the post-Bretton Woods environment of offshore balance sheets that principally denominate their IOUs as dollars, right? So they issue dollar claims. That's sort of the euro-dollar market. It's kind of this network of sort of hierarchical correspondent banking systems that all ultimately clear through New York City, gives the U.S. kind of network power in the global financial system. And then there's the dollar as a sort of a substitute for really talking about the treasury security, right? Which is the reserve asset that underpins that same system. It's what is held as collateral. It's what's rehypothecated in the issuance of dollar credit around the world. It's sort of the standard for this treasury dollar system that has been in existence, ever since we went off the gold standard since 1973. And so when you think about the monetary system that we currently live in, it's been around since then, since 1973. It's been through a number of crises and evolutions, but the fundamental structure of it really hasn't changed since that fateful pivot in 1973. And so the talk of the town, so to speak, is whether we might be going through a similar period of history where the fundamental structure of the system changes, or are we just in a system where it occasionally goes through these crises, it goes through this some tumult, some instability, but the sort of fundamental foundation is still intact. I think that's ultimately the main question dominating all the macro and geopolitical conversation at the moment. Is just this a crisis, sort of a temporary blip associated with the political shift inside DC and an attempt to sort of restructure global trade, and essentially re-anchor security and economic system centered around U.S. interests, that sort of tries to hold a hard line between U.S. allies and partners and China and its ambitions to expand its influence and geo-economic power around the world, or do they actually want to restructure the monetary system itself? And it's been my reading of the tea leaves that since last year, watching Secretary Bessent, or before he was nominated, he gave speeches. Obviously, Steve Moran's a paper has gotten a lot of attention. I think an underappreciated essay was written by Russell Napier in the American Interest last year as well. I think it was October, could be wrong. That basically forecasted this potential period of instability, kind of the sort of potential death of the non-system is sort of what he's called it, because we effectively haven't really had, you could say, like a managed currency system, especially since the rise of China, where kind of the geopolitical hierarchy that ultimately led to agreements like the Plaza Accord and the Louvre Accord, where we could essentially subordinate Japan and these other sort of industrial surplus nations to our interests when ultimately, economic and monetary imbalances got out of control. We could sort of force a reset on our terms. Once China kind of became the dominant industrial producer, the dominant accumulator of dollar surpluses, and then translated that into military and economic power around the world, started to challenge the U.S. as a peer competitor. Fundamentally, that trick that we've played in the past won't work, right? That strategy of essentially ultimately subordinating surplus nations to a currency accord that is reset on our terms doesn't work. So this is why folks are running around like Ray Dalio, essentially saying this is fundamentally different. This is a once in a century style convergence of a geopolitical, rising stress and strain between essentially a challenger nation trying to undermine the status quo led by the U.S. Combined with sort of economic transformation, right? The sort of industrial evolution 2.0, kind of these accelerating changes in the economic productivity coming from AI and robotics and other breakthrough technologies, as well as just the building instability in the monetary system, the treasury market becoming a source of fragility, and the rising imbalances between essentially East and West, between deficit and surplus nations. That these are all kind of converging at the same time. And so the inference is that this time is different. These changes, even the Russians and Chinese have this sort of colloquialism like change is not seen in a generation, change is not seen in a century, which is basically sort of Ray Dalio's line. It's become kind of a popular trope now that like we are entering a period of fundamental system instability that could result in changes to the fundamental monetary order. So that's, I think we're heading in that direction. But it's not a deterministic system. So I'll stop there because we could go on for hours. But I think that's kind of the macro take.
Got it. Yeah, that's super helpful. I think kicking it over to Zack, obviously feel free to weigh in on that too. But I also want to dig into the role of gold here in the sort of global economic system and what role that's playing. But go for it.
Sure. I think before we get to gold, one helpful framing for what's going on geopolitically right now is this term that Bitcoiners have used a long time. It is just starting to break into the sort of mainstream consciousness of Triffin's dilemma, right? And at its core, Triffin's dilemma says that if you have the world reserve currency, and here we're mostly talking about the dollar as the constituent part of treasuries, which is the world reserve asset, then there are trade-offs between domestic policy and foreign objectives. And I think there are these sort of three camps now that are digesting what's happening in the markets very differently. On the left, or in the mainstream media, you've got people who, for the first time, are contemplating the idea that the dollar and treasuries might not play the role that they've played, as far as memory goes back. And a lot of sort of panicked headlines around the disorderliness in the treasury market and yield spiking means that people don't trust the United States in the long term and don't trust our economy. And the sky is falling in that regard. At the other end of the spectrum, you have the sort of like hardcore MAGA wing that are really focused on deindustrialization. The sort of rallying cry there is Main Street over Wall Street. And they don't really care so much about asset prices. They don't care so much about the treasury market. It's really about let's do everything we can to onshore, specifically manufacturing jobs, and make America great again in that regard. And then somewhere in between, you've got the sort of gigabrain version of this coming from Besant and some parts of the Trump administration, where the objective is to outsmart Triffin's dilemma, that we can have it both ways, that we can have this, beautiful deleveraging where we lower the dollar value while keeping the dollar as the world reserve currency and onshore manufacturing and stick the quadruple Lindy axle jump. And we've yet to see which of these things will play out, but these are all both possible outcomes and sort of the perspective that you'd expect from each of these constituent camps. And so I do think that like at the outset you have to sort of take this political lens to understand the way people are digesting things and sort of the possible places that this could go. To the extent that the sort of mainstream left version of this is true, right? That the dollar and treasuries are losing their luster as sort of the neutral default world reserve asset, then that begs the question, okay, what else could there be? Um, Gold is an obvious candidate before the dollar, depending on how you look at it, either before the Bretton Woods system or, until 1971. Gold was the reserve asset around the world, whether or not that was intermediated by paper. And when you look at what happened in 2022, where the United States froze Russia's treasury reserves as part of its sanctions regime, I think there has been a feeling from central banks around the world that the treasury is becoming less of a neutral reserve asset that everyone wants to hold. And so foreign governments have been stacking gold. I don't know if we can share some of our statistics we have on this, but Matt's more familiar than I about the sort of percentage ownership of gold around the world versus, for example, Bitcoin. But one example of an asset that could benefit from treasuries losing status is gold. All sorts of interesting dynamics with gold. There's a lot of gold being repatriated, according to the administration. That's because there was confusion around whether gold would be subject to tariffs, and so you wanted to get it, in the United States before that happened. There are all sorts of other theories about why gold is flying around the world. But yeah, gold is one potential answer if we're moving away from a dollar and sort of debt-based reserve system. Of course, the other is Bitcoin. And we've been seeing really interesting comments from the Trump administration, particularly, Scott Bessent was on Tucker Carlson saying that, discussing gold specifically and saying part of the reason why people are moving to gold now is because it's a store of value, and Bitcoin is becoming a store of value in that way. And so really interested to see specifically the way gold and Bitcoin sort of respectively play out as a response to a perceived, lessening of the treasury's status as a reserve asset.
Okay, follow-up question for you, Zach. So we've heard a lot of talk about the potential for, the United States to basically revalue the gold and then take some of those proceeds and purchase Bitcoin with it. What, obviously besides getting a bunch of Bitcoin for the United States, what are the geopolitical implications of doing that?
So I think it really depends on the messaging. So revaluing the gold is really just an accounting trick. By statute in 1973, we said that gold has, officially a price of something like $42 per ounce, up from the $35 per ounce Bretton Woods price. Congress could rewrite the law and say, okay, we're going to mark gold up to its current value of around $3,000 per ounce. And that would create a large surplus on Treasury's books that we could then spend on stuff. It's basically bringing money into existence. I think the sort of geopolitical response would depend on why we did that, right? Are we doing that and then selling the gold to pay down our debts? Are we doing that to sell the gold to buy Bitcoin? Are we doing that to add assets to the sovereign wealth fund of the United States? I think here really it depends on the sort of revaluing the gold is a one-time trick we can do that adds almost $1 trillion to our balance sheet on paper. But I think the way that's received really depends on, okay, why are we doing that, and why do we think that this is the moment where we want to do that sort of one-time maneuver?
Any thoughts on the gold revaluation?
Yeah, I guess I'd step back and say, ultimately, monetary zones are demarcated by security zones, right? And if the security zone of the global order is changing or being challenged, then you should just expect that to result in changes to the monetary zone, right? And that the provision of security is the belief by this administration, essentially, is the provision of a public good by the United States to the global economic order, and that essentially that public good has been exploited by mercantilist actors like China that essentially get a free ride on that public good. And so one way of kind of trying to rebalance global trade is essentially a way of forcing mercantilist nations to essentially pay for that global public good. And the way that we would enforce that payment is essentially by forcing those that we can coerce or induce to pay for the public good by subsidizing the provision of those security services, which requires essentially debt issuance. And so this involves forcing buyers of our debt that otherwise wouldn't, from a market perspective, purchase it at a given yield or duration. That's ultimately kind of like the conceptual framework, right? To boiling it down behind kind of what's motivating all these monetary and currency maneuvers between the great powers, right? And kind of this high stakes negotiation kind of reset the terms. And so each nation is then looking in their own kind of inventory of tools and assets to see what are my vulnerabilities, what are my strengths, and each nation, especially the great powers, have a different distribution of those tools. And so the United States has a certain distribution of tools. In particular, right, it's like legacy incumbent status and control over global networks in various ways, including security networks, intelligence sharing networks, telecommunications networks, as well as financial networks. But it has had a kind of a, maybe a vulnerability when it comes to harder assets, right? It essentially sells financial assets to the world in exchange for, paper promises. And gets consumer goods, right? Essentially, that's been a really good trade that's worked out for some elements of the U.S. political economy. But it has led to a atrophy of the defense industrial base that elements of the U.S. security establishment want to reverse in haste. So the gold is the old standby, right? Gold is kind of always seen as kind of the risk off, flight to safety, fear trade, right? And it's seen by nations and sovereigns as a store of value going back millennia, right? And so it's kind of the default base asset of the global system, even if in the past 50 years, it's kind of been agreed upon by all the governments of the world to kind of pretend that gold is not a monetary metal. But ultimately, gold is not really useful in a 21st century economy, right? To settle complex trade between many different nations. It's inherently centralizable. It's expensive to transport. And, that's the reason why various gold standards broke down, right? They ultimately weren't sustainable. And it's subject to the same sorts of pressures. Ultimately, when you get states competing with themselves, they want to have room for maneuver. They want to borrow money, right, to finance conflicts or military expenditures, and they don't like having their hands tied with gold. So ultimately, when push comes to shove, they just sort of they rug gold basically, or they rug the gold paper market. And so we have been seeing quite dramatic shift in global gold flows that have been of interest to U.S. intelligence community for some time now. There was a story in a Swiss magazine about a U.S. military official in Switzerland remarking about the fact that they have noticed that overflights of U.S. and Chinese satellites using a certain type of synthetic aperture radar that's very useful to track very tiny movements in sort of subsurface sort of changes in, say, the depth of a mountaintop sort of gold vault, or trucks moving into a facility, or ships leaving a port. Both China and Russia have been acutely monitoring Switzerland. Why would they do that unless it's basically to monitor gold flows? And there's been gold flows now have been picked up in the official statistics flowing out of Switzerland into the U.S. and China in the Middle East, picking up and accelerating the last few months. So that's curious. It sort of looks like folks preparing for something. The gold certificates, right, is a bit of this sort of one-time use historical accounting anachronism that is available, right, on the books of the U.S. government per the 1973 Par Value Modernization Act, that if you were to mark those to market, would essentially free up fiat reserves, right, credited from the Fed to the Treasury, roughly 800 billion, depending on the price of gold at the time that it's marked up. And those reserves could be used for a variety of different purposes, including, say, help to fund Bitcoin purchases for the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve, help provide seed capital for the Sovereign Wealth Fund, help defease existing debt by funding buybacks, which Secretary Besson has talked about, or just reduce debt issuance themselves. So you have just less issuance than the market expects at certain tenors, and that helps bring down yields. So that's a policy idea that we have proposed. It's essentially is the core mechanism behind the Bitcoin Act, introduced by Senator Lummis. But these things can be adapted depending on the strategic and political objectives you have. And so the gold certificates are kind of like a subplot in this larger strategic competitive dynamic where ultimately it's a matter of who's got the leverage in different parts of the system. The one point I would say is, gold and monetary concerns are just one element of this competition and this dynamic that the policymakers are viewing as these different levers they could pull against each other, right? So there's no coincidence that we saw China restrict rare earth exports in response to the escalation of the tariff war. And so these are, states have the ability to escalate, horizontally as well as vertically, right? They can choose to escalate in a different domain, right? Where instead of just tariffs, you go to export controls, right? And we can do tit for tat with semiconductor controls, right? We can do tit for tat with KYC for the cloud to stop AI companies from training large language models in, say, Singapore, right? So there's a sort of full spectrum of competition that when you have the great powers of the world, specifically US and China, deciding they're going to ante up against each other to try to basically see who's going to blink, that's going to spill over into lots of different domains. And so then I think policymakers are going to increasingly look to maybe more non-traditional tools, non-traditional ideas for asymmetric advantage or resilience. And that's basically been BPI's take for a while, is seeing this competition coming, seeing the escalation of these rivalries come to the fore. It behooves the United States to take a hard and creative look at all the different tools it has on the table and to see in different situations, where does it have unappreciated vulnerabilities and risks, and where does it have underappreciated opportunities and advantages. I think one of those that I think we want to draw special attention to is Bitcoin, right? And so just to make this point on the statistics that Zack referenced, if you just do sort of back of the envelope math, and I think some folks that will be collaborating shortly with some data to sort of back this up with hard numbers, but I think it's a fair estimate. If you wanted to compare, say, US holdings of Bitcoin as a percentage of the total available supply and US holdings of gold as a function of the total above ground stock, I think a good estimate, rough, is roughly America probably holds 35 to 40% of all the available Bitcoin. That's been mined, and that's not been burned. Whereas we probably hold about 8 to 10% of the total above ground gold supply. And so if you're just holding everything else equal and you're just asking the basic question, if you know you're going into a world where on a relative basis, neutral reserve hard assets like gold and Bitcoin are going to monetize at some pace, which one is more in the US interest to see monetize, right? It's the one that we hold on a 4-to-1 ratio, right? More than the rest of the world. And then if you add in the plausible assumption that in such a monetization scenario of these harder assets, which one is going to move faster, gold or Bitcoin? I think it's pretty clear that we expect Bitcoin to move much faster and much further than gold, right? So in terms of like the strategic leverage, there's an asymmetric advantage for the United States to having Bitcoin monetized relative to gold. It could be even a 10 or 20 or even a 40-to-1 advantage in terms of the monetization kind of capital power that gets accumulated as a result of getting Bitcoin to monetize at the expense of gold, which has been accumulated and hoarded by our Eurasian rivals or middle powers for several years now. So that's kind of my like rant on that subject. And I think it's one of these ideas that is important to just put on the table so that when the policymakers who are dealing with a lot of chaos and a lot of, lots of different policy ideas and levers know exists, and that it provides them optionality along that path.
Yeah, I think there's another way of thinking about this. There's a very popular internet meme where you've got two people sitting on a bus and they're both thinking the same thing, but one person is looking out the window at a beautiful valley and the other person is looking at a rock wall because they're on a mountain trail. And it's really sort of the two sides of the same coin that you can have with regard to a state of affairs. And if we go back to our friend Triffin's dilemma here, I think you can run that same thought exercise. On the what's going on here, right? Just factually, is that we've been printing metaphorical pieces of paper, and we've been sending those around the world, paper that we just create, fiat money, in exchange for goods and services from specialized economies, right? Actual manufacturing goods from China, services from all over the world, and so we've been trading sort of in some ways fake things for real things. On the one hand, if you're looking out towards the canyon, that's an incredible deal. It's allowed us to get extraordinarily wealthy, have a highly financialized economy where our money is very valuable. We get actual stuff that we didn't have to create, and then when we pay for that stuff, that money gets reinvested back into American assets, and it makes Americans that own financial assets wealthy. The looking at the Rockwall version of this is that we've specialized in creating paper out of thin air, and other countries around the world have specialized in creating actual useful things that you need to run an economy. And so we're less resilient, we're less self-sufficient, and there are all sorts of sort of vulnerabilities that system creates. I think regardless of how you look at it, and like I said before, I think how you look at it probably depends on where you sit in the economy. If you are in the Rust Belt, you probably see it one way. If you're in a big coastal elite city, you probably see it the other way. We need to figure out a bridge from here to what's next. So if you want to take the optimistic view of Triffin's dilemma, you want to keep our sort of privilege of being able to borrow and buy stuff going as long as possible. And when you start to see shakes in the system, like we're seeing right now, you need to think, all right, what is it we can do that people will keep buying our debt? Even when we've shown that maybe it's not so neutral because we can freeze it. Even when we've shown that, like, okay, we're actually accumulating so much debt that eventually we're going to need to print a bunch of money. And a hard asset like Bitcoin or gold can be helpful in that regard. If, on the other hand, you think we need to start onshoring a lot of physical capabilities and manufacturing and retool the American economy to be more resilient and self-sufficient, you need a bridge between here and there, because that can't happen overnight. You can't just snap your fingers and have factories appear and have whole industries appear out of whole cloth. And so you need to be able to finance the transition from where we are to there. And then too, hard assets like Bitcoin and gold that we can use in international trade directly, or we can use to back our debt. And maybe later we'll talk about bit bonds as sort of like a special case of this. It can be really helpful in that regard. And then if you're in this middle, we're going to outsmart Triffin's dilemma camp, same thing. This is a tool that can be used to do that. And so as between the obvious examples of Bitcoin and gold as a hard asset that can be used, I think here the fact that relatively we own a lot more of the Bitcoin than we own of the gold, that's a real check in favor of Bitcoin. The fact that Bitcoin has just begun its process of monetization, while gold has, the Lindy of thousands of years of monetary history behind it. Yeah, gold has room to go up, but probably Bitcoin has a lot more room to go up. The fact that Bitcoin is digital and can be sent basically instantly and for free across the globe if you ever needed to call on the collateral behind debt, if we're going to use it that way, that's a big advantage in favor of Bitcoin. And so just from like forget as Bitcoiners for a second, BPI really tries to take the position, what is good for America? How can we create good Bitcoin policy for America? Bitcoin, I think, is really an indispensable tool in this regard. Basically, whatever you think of Triffin's dilemma, whatever you think of the last 50 or 80 years of American economic history, wherever we're going next, Bitcoin is a really important asset to help us get there.
All right, I wanna go down the Bitcoin portion here a little bit more. So part of the executive order that we saw come out of the White House was basically an audit of the existing Bitcoin holdings of the United States. And as far as I'm aware, that was supposed to be released, a week or two ago. And I think we've heard pretty much radio silence. So are we worried about the results of that audit? Does that change anything as far as the conversation that we just had? Pines, you want to take us away on this?
Yeah, so one point of clarification, I don't believe, although I have to go back and read, that the order explicitly promised to release the results of the audit. It just said they had to conduct an audit and, essentially report back to the president. And so it's up to the president to decide if he wants to release the results. It's my understanding that audit has been done, but is, may have been done and communicated in the depths of the tariff crisis. So it could just be a piece of paper sitting on a desk underneath lots of other pieces of paper. And so I don't know how much signal there is in the silence, right? There's been a lot going on. But I also separately have heard credible indications that the U.S. government had been selling Bitcoin, leading up to the inauguration. I don't know how much. Obviously, some folks on social media have communicated explicit knowledge that this is happening at scale. I don't know that for a fact, but I know it's a suspicion that Bitcoin sales were occurring. So it would be very important to understand exactly what is the current position of the United States Bitcoin holdings as a baseline to understand, okay, what is the content of the strategic Bitcoin reserve and where does that stack up against other countries, right? Ultimately, if Donald Trump wants to make good on his promise to be a Bitcoin superpower, well, that ultimately comes down to how much Bitcoin you have. And so this is a measure of how much the United States is making good on that rhetorical objective. And it also means that there could be additional pressure, depending on the size of what's in the actual holdings, for additional budget neutral purchases, right? That have been also kind of in development over the past several weeks, and are also kind of due to the White House imminently. I don't understand the exact sequence right now, but my understanding is that both Treasury and Commerce have been instructed per the executive order to develop very concrete policy proposals. These are taking the form of 2 to 3 page kind of memo ideas that are meant to essentially lay out, okay, how can we make good on this ambition that Bo Hines has articulated as essentially being quite unbounded in a sense, to acquire as much Bitcoin as possible that's fits within that constraint of being budget neutral. So they've articulated things, not just these gold certificates, which in my opinion require legislation, because the official price of gold can only be changed with legislation. But there are other means of acquiring Bitcoin in a budget neutral fashion where you're not using either debt issuance or taxpayer funds. That's kind of, in my understanding, kind of the definition, right? And so essentially these are other revenues the government can leverage, or other assets that it can sell in order to acquire Bitcoin. Right, so revenues that could be used to acquire additional Bitcoin would be things like, say, tariff revenues or other fees that the government collects that are not tax-based fees, royalties, etc., from oil and gas leases, or outright sales of federal land, physical gold, other digital assets that it holds, spectrum of auction spectrums, as well as potential privatizations of, say, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So there's a whole kit and caboodle of ideas, some somewhat trivial in terms of their impact, some very, very large, right, in the tens of billions of dollars. And so there's a lot of ideas that I think are being put on the table, and then it's a question of, okay, who's got the political capital inside the administration to push and execute which of those ideas. And there's an interagency working group that, of course, was established by that executive order that's chaired by Bo, that will be making those decisions in the next few weeks and months. And so we are very much focused on that, as well as the legislative side with the Bitcoin Act. And so I think that's where we are in this sort of interesting moment. Obviously, I think the last 2 to 3 weeks of headlines kind of took a lot of the attention. I think a lot of the senior principals, cabinet secretaries had a lot of other things to deal with. So I can imagine there's a lot of Bitcoin related items on the agenda that have been sort of on the back burner, right? And then that's just a matter of time before the next meeting is scheduled, where the senior principals will review and approve courses of action to acquire additional Bitcoin. And the last point I'll say on that is, it's also my understanding that other countries are now paying very close attention to what the U.S. government is doing. I think they had the same reaction that a lot of the market participants had after the election, and then after the inauguration, and then after the relevant appointments, and then after the executive orders, which was, okay, reassessing and sort of rebaselining their priors for how serious is the Trump administration about moving in a pro-Bitcoin direction, and how serious are they about actually acquiring Bitcoin. And I think the direction of travel on like a month over 1 month basis, if you had like a weighted average of kind of the median belief around the world, especially among decision makers in national capitals, has only been on a trend line up since then. And those systems, those countries have their own internal bureaucratic inertia and mechanisms of, okay, once we read this signal from the US, how do we interpret that signal? And then how does that signal get sort of passed along inside their ministries and national leadership? It's my understanding that signal is being processed and is now being passed along. And so you have everyone from Hong Kong to the Middle East to the Norwegians, to the British, to the Singaporeans, to the Japanese, all kind of looking at what the US is doing on Bitcoin, and they have to internalize and react. And that's a process that's playing out now. I expect it's taking place in the context of these larger changes. And I think everyone is now, starting to stitch together potentially what Bitcoin might mean for the US, as it seems to be intent on precipitating pretty strategic shakeup in the global system.
So looking at the specific text of the executive order, sort of from a legal perspective, first, the audit was due 30 days from the original release of the executive order, which was March 6th. So that's already been due, but specifically it's due to the Secretary of the Treasury and the President's Working Group on Digital Assets, the Bo Hines and David Sachs group. It's not necessarily due to the public. I would not be surprised if there were complexities or difficulties in actually doing this audit. There are lots of parts of the government, maybe or maybe not expertise in Bitcoin within each of those groups. And it might be that there's stranded Bitcoin places, there's issues with classification, there's issues with storage of Bitcoin. And so be very curious to see if this ever becomes public, what it is that they found. But the executive order doesn't call for that. To me, the big legal question right now is, what does the term budget neutral mean? I've heard some folks suggest a sort of very stringent version of budget neutral, which is, it can't touch US dollars because money is fungible. And if you spend dollars on buying Bitcoin, that could have been used elsewhere in the budget. That could have been used to pay down the debt. And so, that would be a very constraining interpretation. And maybe that would get you to something like selling existing cryptocurrencies the United States government has where there's a trading pair with Bitcoin. So you never reach dollars, but it really narrows what you can do from a budget neutral perspective. I personally think a much more like straightforward reading of it, what it means to be budget neutral, is it can't impact other budget line items. So you're not cutting government programs, you're not cutting entitlements, you're not actually cutting off or changing different flows of money from the United States government. Under that interpretation, I think there's a lot more latitude to do things that are budget neutral, right? Also, the executive order says budget neutral and not increasing taxes on Americans, which I think suggests that those are different things. So one budget neutral thing you could do, except for the government has made clear they don't want to do it, is raise a tax to buy Bitcoin. That would be budget neutral because you're not taking away money otherwise allocated in the budget. But tariffs are not something that cost the American taxpayer money. And that's something that Bo Hines has recently suggested we could do to raise money for Bitcoin. Selling assets that are already on the government's balance sheet, right? Selling gold, monetizing other assets like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac would be budget neutral in this regard. Using the Exchange Stabilization Fund, which is meant to be sort of a slush fund or rainy day fund to prop up the long-term value of the dollar and by extension US debt, which is what we were talking about earlier. That would be budget neutral in that regard. So be very interested to see when the papers come out that are due from both the Treasury Department and the Commerce Department. How are they interpreting what it means to be budget neutral? And that'll give us a lot of information that's otherwise, sort of not explicitly stated in the executive order about what latitude we have to look for different assets or different capital flows that could be monetized to purchase Bitcoin in a quote unquote budget neutral way.
And Zach, I don't know if you have the EO up, but one of the other things, more kind of technical minutia, that is very important in the EO is the establishment of an office to manage the SBR, right? And so this is where the bureaucratic devil's in the details of like an office, in the common parlance inside DC is like a formal kind of official bureaucratic entity, like it's a construct at a certain level of hierarchy inside a department or agency. And so an executive order saying we need to create a new office to manage the SBR, like you got to think in terms of the typical DC bureaucrat who's now, okay, how do I implement this? Now I have to like basically add a box on the org chart that says the office of the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve. And there needs to be people like reassigned from existing positions, GS-15s or whatever, to manage and staff that office, to execute, all these purchases, to develop the memos, to like understand the accounting, to understand the tracking, right? You actually have to have people put into a new thing and charged with a very specific task. And of course, this is happening in the same time that you have Doge going through all these agencies, people taking early retirements, people taking buyouts, people being fired, a lot of instability in just the general federal workforce. And I think the Treasury Department and Commerce Department, of course, not immune from that. And so I just, folks need to kind of understand it's like there's a lot of like tactical and operational details associated with going from a piece of paper side of the White House and like actual Bitcoin being purchased with government assets, right? People have to execute that. And it's government officials that are going to have to execute that. And I haven't seen any indications publicly as to like where that office is literally going to sit. Like what level of person is going to be put in charge of it? where it's going to sit inside the bureaucracy, how it's going to staff up, how formal it's going to be, whether it's going to be a formal thing or not, right? So I think the way that bureaucracy could sort of try to undermine this, right, would be to kind of sort of make a sort of a fake office, right? Like it's a fictitious office. It just sort of, yeah, we put it on the org chart, but it doesn't actually have anyone in it. And the sort of, it becomes a collateral duty of some, collection of senior advisors or whatever. But it doesn't get staffed up, et cetera, right? And it requires like top down level, forcing function to see, no, this is a serious, national priority. We need to dedicate resources and personnel to it. And, that's going to take time to stand up. Like people don't just like, okay, like most folks in the Treasury Department have an existing job, right? And this new thing was just created. So who's going to leave their current job to do this new job? They're going to take it on as a second collateral duty, right? These are like very like practical things that have to be worked through. And these don't take, like a matter of days or weeks. Those take months, right? And so that's just my expectation, is that you have kind of this, my observation is just there are two different sort of speeds, right? There's the White House, which is moving at tech speed, as David Sachs has said, right? Flurries of executive orders, move fast, right? Like execute. And then you have the, existing inertia of the federal bureaucracy, which has procedures and memos and people doing existing things. And, if you want to change this, like anything that has large mass, right, has large inertia. It's resistant to change just by its nature, right? And so there's an inherent, kind of difference between the speed that the White House wants to go and the speed that the federal bureaucracy almost can go. And I think we're seeing that play out with the Bitcoin policy moves.
Yeah, I think that's all broadly and directionally true. And I do think a constraint on the speed here is going to be the unprecedented nature of what this executive order is trying to do, and the fact that there just necessarily aren't people in the bureaucracy that know how to create a strategic Bitcoin reserve, because the concept is so brand new. In terms of the text of the executive order, interestingly though, so the Treasury Department is directed to create an office to administer custodial accounts that will amount to the strategic Bitcoin reserve and the digital asset stockpile. So there is not, it's not clear, as you say, Matt, who's in that office, but their job is just to administer these custodial accounts, where there is a time window where each department of the government, if it has final title to the Bitcoin, right, they are directed within 30 days to figure out, okay, what Bitcoin do we have from civil criminal forfeiture that belongs to the U.S. government at this point versus belong to creditors or victims, like in the case of Bitfinex. Separately, though, the strategy to acquire more Bitcoin, right? This is the important part. This is about the sort of forward-looking purchases and what budget neutral means. That's not about the office. The specific tasking there is the Secretary of the Treasury and the Secretary of Commerce, and it does not call for that same level of delegation or uncertainty about who'd actually be doing it. And it's interesting. I'm guessing that wasn't an accident, and that this executive order really is meant to like sort of force the at least the discussion of how it is that we come to acquire a bunch of Bitcoin on behalf of the federal government.
All right. I want to tie these threads together here. So we started off with the sort of, global economic reordering conversation. We got into the strategic Bitcoin reserve. But I guess the question here, and we'll go to Pines first, to what extent is the White House taking the strategic Bitcoin reserve seriously from a strategic perspective? Or do you think it's possible that it's still kind of like, oh, this was just a Trump campaign promise? Are they really kind of clued in to the potential strategic value of, a monetization of Bitcoin at a faster pace than gold, seeing that gold has, sort of become a more popular reserve asset?
I mean, it's hard to personify the White House as like a single entity with a single set of beliefs. I think you could just look at the trade policy and say, well, there is no kind of univalent opinion on what the right way to approach this strategic policy of trade is. You have different camps, you have different folks that have different beliefs and attitudes towards Bitcoin. Some that I think are very much informed by its strategic potential and its relevance in a geopolitical competition. I think there are very serious folks at senior positions, as well as folks kind of inside the bureaucracy, national security positions, and economic policy positions that get that. But there's other folks that just see it as it's the digital asset kind of industry. And yeah, they were a hardcore supporter of the administration getting elected, so they need to be, respected. They need to have a voice. They need to get, their policy views listened to. But they don't see it as as a level of sort of national strategic policymaking. They might see things like AI or military defense and related supply chain issues as being more important than Bitcoin, right? And that might be a fair judgment, right? Like I think these things are all kind of competing for scarce attention at the White House level. I think it's fair to say though, right? Like to a certain extent, the executive order is the word of the president, right? And it literally said Bitcoin is digital gold and is a strategic asset that is in our strategic interest to acquire. Um, you know, Words matter, especially words coming out of the White House on official government seal, right? With the president's signature. Like other countries react to that, right? Like they don't necessarily try to zoom into someone's brain and be like, well, did they really believe it, right? Did they secretly change their mind? Ultimately, it's okay. The official policy position of the United States government that people react to, and that issues essentially top-down commander's intent to the rest of the bureaucracy. So that's what we're seeing play out, right? We just talked about like a miniature version of that. But I think there's also folks inside the Defense Department, for example, that that get all of this, right? Get all of what we just talked about, basically. Understand the structure of the global economic monetary system has worked to undermine U.S. national security, right? And it's how to reset it on terms that are favorable to our interest. And they've increasingly started to view Bitcoin as a component of that rebalancing strategy. And that's not just like a sop to some political constituency, right? That is like a hard-nosed realist assessment of a policy option that needs to be seriously explored. And so that's basically my assessment.
Anything to
Yeah,
add on
I
that,
don't.
Zach? Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was sad. I don't have much to add to that. I agree with everything Matt said. Just to underscore the point that while I think the answer is both, there are both people that see this as a campaign promise. There are people that don't really understand it but want to be supportive, and then there are people who really deeply get it. On balance, definitely the Overton window has shifted. The conversations we've been having at BPI are hugely different than they were a year ago. Some of this is the executive order. Some of this, I think, is from the ETFs. But the extent to which people take Bitcoin seriously in policymaking, it is really genuinely different than it ever has been in the history of Bitcoin.
Okay, great. Zach, can you spell this out a little bit more for us? I want to be kind of crystal clear about this. So say the United States starts buying Bitcoin en masse, right? Say, Lummis's Bitcoin Act gets through. How does that shift the sort of, global economic power structure here? And what role is Bitcoin playing in that specifically?
Yeah, I think it depends a little bit on the timing. But if we take sort of the strong case of the Bitcoin Act gets passed, right? The Bitcoin Act calls for the revaluing of gold that we talked about before, and using basically the entirety of those proceeds to buy 1 million Bitcoin over 5 years. If the United States announces that we are buying 1 million Bitcoin, that's just a global seismic shock. Right? I think that really is a big deal. I think first the Bitcoin price goes through the roof, right? I think we probably go very quickly to something like $1 million per Bitcoin. And then you have to wait and see what are the sort of dominoes to fall from that, right? What are the second order effects of Bitcoin just being monetized on a faster trajectory than I think a lot of people anticipate? The first is sort of other nation states' reactions. So other nation states will see sort of, you can't be left behind. I suspect that Bitcoin being monetized that strongly and that quickly would have a negative impact on sort of the long-term outlook for gold, right? It really says to the world, gold has a credible competitor, not just because a bunch of Bitcoin people who've studied Bitcoin really closely say so, but clearly Bitcoin is monetizing in a way that gold has monetized in the past. And so central banks around the world will have to sort of re-underwrite what mix of assets they want to hold. They probably up their exposure to Bitcoin. That probably increases the Bitcoin price even more from that point. And then, that will create a real different balance of power than there is now, right? It will create a lot of wealth in the United States, both for the federal government, right, as it buys this asset that's going up a lot in price, that makes our balance sheet looks really good. But also there are lots of Bitcoin companies and Bitcoin miners and individuals that hold a lot of Bitcoin in America. So one thing that we would see is sort of an enrichment within the United States in a really rapid succession. That probably has some impact on global trade.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Okay. Yeah, so that'll definitely have some impact on global trade. I think there will be some, and this is something we think a lot about BPI. I think there will be some sort of national security questions about how does the United States government interface with the Bitcoin network, right? Because, all right, once the asset becomes super important, now we have to deal with the externalities for the other two sort of legs of the stool, which are mining and then the Bitcoin network, the technology itself. And so we're going to have to really think carefully about protecting the asset, right? We don't want to do things that would, for example, destroy fungibility of Bitcoin. That would be a real mistake. But what policy do we want vis-a-vis these other things? We want to be supportive of Bitcoin mining in the United States, but we also don't want to create weird incentives that could undermine the sort of free market incentives of mining. I think we'd start to see the United States use Bitcoin as a diplomatic tool, a way to maybe move dollars via stablecoin rails on Bitcoin or on similar networks across the world. You'd see probably the government using Bitcoin to be a replacement for fiat debasement in authoritarian countries where their monetary policy is part of one of the sort of central tool of their authoritarianism. But the sort of Overton window is so wide at that point. If the United States embraces Bitcoin in that way, I think all we can say is Bitcoin becomes much more important, becomes more valuable. It inures to the economic benefit of the United States. And then we're going to have a lot of fascinating, but in some cases, difficult policy choices to make about how we want to sort of play that card.
Yeah, I think it's important to think about in terms of scenarios and time horizons, and we don't have another hour to go. So I'll kind of just refer folks to the white paper that BPI put out, Global Economic Reordering, U.S. China Competition, and Bitcoin as a tool of statecraft. At the end, we sort of lay out three kind of canonical scenarios, kind of being relatively conservative. A, where Bitcoin continues to appreciate as a diversified asset in global portfolios, but remains a fraction of gold. Scenario B, where essentially reaches rough parity with gold as a neutral reserve asset that's seen as actually a complement to gold as a store of value in institutional portfolios, sovereign wealth funds, national reserves. And then a scenario where it displaces gold and starts to eat into other assets that have a store value premium, say global bond markets, real estate, etc. Those are very different scenarios, and you have to assess like the timelines. And it's also important to think about the intersection between each of those scenarios and the pace of monetization of Bitcoin, and the intersection with the existing global dollar treasury standard, right? And I think the ideal path for the United States is essentially to graft on this monetization of Bitcoin to the legacy system, right? To create a hybrid monetary standard, which essentially is a Bitcoin stablecoin standard that gradually sort of buttresses and competes against buttresses kind of the legacy U.S. dollar treasury standard and holds the line against kind of a BRICS-based CBDC gold standard, right? And so there's a lot of interesting dynamics between those different interests, but just the mechanical one is stablecoins obviously are a priority of the administration, a priority of Congress. They see putting in place a regime that helps dollar-based stablecoins proliferate as being critical, not just for the dollar network expanding around the world, but also through kind of the balance sheets of stablecoins expanding demand for U.S. Treasury securities. And to a certain extent, there's like a mechanical link between the dollar Bitcoin price and the amount of stablecoins you need to intermediate global Bitcoin and crypto trade. There's a mechanical increase in the size of those stablecoin balance sheets, a mechanical increase in their demand for treasury debt. So these things are kind of linked together just on a mechanical basis, and they could be linked even further on a policy basis. And so I think this is an idea, a concept that started off being theoretical a few years ago, and we were writing about it, and is now becoming more practical and is now potentially going to shift to actual policy implementation. And this is kind of the thesis is Bitcoin and dollar-based stablecoins are synergistic from the point of view of kind of U.S. national security interests and geopolitical interests. But as Zack mentions, like the success of that strategy will then present a larger set of policy questions, right? The distribution of global hash rate, the relationship between the Bitcoin as a censorship resistant technology and stablecoins as a means of surveillance and control, individual privacy, relationship between the state and society. So just because America decides to go all in on Bitcoin doesn't mean like the work of BPI is done. That's where it just begins.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could literally do several more hours on that topic because it's super interesting. One thing that we definitely don't have time for today, but would love to talk about on a future episode that I've been thinking a lot about recently is sort of the other obvious domain of huge sort of great power geopolitical nation state games here is around artificial intelligence and the prospect of something like artificial general intelligence by the end of this decade, which technologists are taking more and more seriously. And there, I think specifically the censorship resistant nature of the Bitcoin network could have a huge role to play in the way it intersects with questions around AI, right? And AI alignment, and having a form of money that, quantum questions aside, basically no matter how smart you are, you're not going to be able to brute force the Bitcoin cryptography. I think that's a very important, and a country can't just manipulate the supply or censor transactions. I think that's a really important piece of that puzzle as we think about, okay, we're advancing in AI, China's going to advance in AI. What does that mean sort of over the long term? Bitcoin, I think, could be an indispensable tool that will push us maybe more in the direction of sort of on the margin cooperation and peace rather than sort of being existentially at grips with each other.
Yeah, and I would say, I guess my intellectual strategy, I think the professional strategy of BPI that's worked out successfully the past few years has been identifying these issues that have been just outside the Overton window, but that are on a trajectory inside the Overton window, and that degree of pace is accelerating. And so I think we've seen Bitcoin accelerate in that trajectory from outside the Overton window to squarely in the center, right? From being a fringe thing where people are worried about it being banned or being sneered as a scam to now essentially being designated as strategic asset by the President of the United States and having that ripple across the world. That is just an objective, like dramatic acceleration of a particular policy issue from outside to well inside the Overton window. AI discourse has gone through a similar trajectory almost along the same timeline, where it was kind of a topic of fringe blogs, a number of years ago, this prospect of AGI or even artificial superintelligence takeoff scenarios, and kind of what would be the existential risk considerations associated with that, as well as the geopolitical considerations and strategies that would have to be considered. And now that is, again, also accelerating to the center of the discourse. My own other special topic is also accelerating into the center of the discourse. So we're in this regime in the next, I think it's going to be the next 2 to 3 years in particular, that we're going to see these sort of layered hockey sticks of kind of policy issues that the existing institutions, the existing political leadership, either don't have the personal experience or technical competence to really understand deeply, and yet it's going to come crashing on their front door, right? If it isn't already, and there's going to be demand for new institutions. I think BPI is going to be one of them to help policymakers understand these changes, these accelerations, and to help steer government policy in a way that optimizes national security interests and geopolitical advantage while preserving our open societies and our commitment to individual liberties, right? And that is going to be the defining question in this age of disruption, right? The tendency in history is when things start to get unstable, the state likes to arrogate more power to itself just to maintain control, to try to keep the wheels from falling off the ship. And so democracies and liberal values are often the first things to be discarded when you enter periods of geopolitical competition, accelerating change, or overall political instability. And so I think it's incumbent on institutions that have a mandate to commit to supporting open societies and liberalism and a path for technological flourishing that doesn't lead to dystopian failure modes or existential risk, to sort of step up to the plate. And so I think BPI is going to lean in to these issues that are increasingly going to interrelate with each other, as Zack mentioned, and that fundamentally they require multidisciplinary synoptic perspectives to help get policymakers read up, read in, and understand how to make good decisions.
Yeah, I don't think the aliens are going to want to take Cardano, so someone has to stand up for the better asset here.
Amazing. All right. Sounds like we got a lot to talk about next week. Thank you, gentlemen, and we'll see everyone next week.
The cliffhanger. Stay
The
tuned.
cliffhanger.